I pulled into the Blackwood Research Facility parking lot at 11:45 that night, my Honda wheezing after the 40-mile drive through nothing but cornfields and abandoned farms. The headlights swept across a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, then settled on the main building, a concrete block that squatted in the darkness like something that didn't want to be noticed. Should have been my first warning. Places that hide out here, this far from anything, they're hiding for a reason. But I needed the job. 3 months behind on rent, $68,000 in student loans, and a journalism degree that turned out to be worth less than the paper it was printed on. The ad had been simple. Night shift data entry, science background helpful but not required, immediate start. They'd called me back within an hour of applying. The guard booth was empty. I waited 5 minutes before the gate rolled open on its own, metal grinding against metal in a way that made my teeth ache. The parking lot stretched out bigger than it looked from the road, maybe 200 spaces, but only 3 other cars huddled near the entrance. Inside, the lobby felt like a hospital that had given up on healing anybody. White tile floors reflected the fluorescent lights wrong, creating shadows where there shouldn't be any. The air tasted recycled, metallic. A woman sat behind the reception desk, her face hidden behind a computer monitor. "Mario Porter," I said. "I'm starting tonight." She looked up, mid-40s, wire-rimmed glasses, black hair in a bob so perfect it could have been molded from plastic. Her lab coat was pristine white, like she'd just unwrapped it. "Mr. Porter." Her voice had that detached quality you hear in emergency room doctors, the ones who've seen too much. "I'm Shannon Alexander, head researcher for the night shift. You're punctual. That's good. Punctuality matters here." She stood, smoothing down her lab coat even though it didn't have a single wrinkle. "Follow me. I'll introduce you to the others." We walked down a corridor that seemed longer than the building should have allowed. Our footsteps echoed wrong, the sound arriving a half-second late, like it had to travel somewhere else first. Shannon walked with mechanical precision, each step exactly the same length. "How familiar are you with Dickinson?" she asked suddenly. "The poet? I heard a fly buzz when I died." She said it like she was checking items off a list. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air, between the heaves of storm. I waited for her to explain why she was quoting poetry about death, but she just kept walking. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fear sweat. 2 people sat at a plastic table, a security guard built like a refrigerator and a woman in a lab coat checking her watch every few seconds. "Roberto Gordon," Shannon said, gesturing to the guard. "He maintains our perimeter integrity." Roberto looked up at me with bloodshot eyes, scanning me like he was checking for weapons, or maybe checking if I was a weapon. 50-something gray hair cropped military short, wearing a security uniform with odd bulges underneath, like he'd stuffed newspaper or maybe something harder under the fabric. An old knife scar ran along his forearm. "You're new," he said. Wasn't a question. His hand moved to his belt where a flashlight hung next to what looked like a sharpened piece of rebar. "Stay out of the basements. Don't go anywhere alone after 2 a.m. And if you hear your name called from somewhere you can't see, you don't answer." "Roberto has been with us 3 years, Shannon said, like he hadn't just given me survival instructions. "He's very dedicated." The woman at the table checked her watch again, 11:57 and 32 seconds, if I had to guess from her micro-expressions. Dark ponytail pulled tight enough to hurt, burn scar on her right hand, lab coat over jeans and running shoes. "Ellen Chandler," Shannon continued, "laboratory technician. She ensures our specimens remain properly documented." Ellen's eyes darted to the door, then back to me. "You're replacing Russell Gonzalez." "I didn't know I was replacing anyone." "He worked data entry," Roberto said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Started asking questions about Laboratory 7. Haven't seen him in 2 weeks." "Russell submitted his resignation," Shannon said, her tone unchanged. "Family emergency. These things happen." Ellen checked her watch again. Roberto's hand tightened on the sharpened rebar. Shannon led me out of the break room, down another corridor that branched off in directions that didn't quite make sense. The building felt bigger on the inside, like one of those optical illusions that hurt to look at too long. "Your workstation," she announced, opening a door to a small office. Desk, computer, filing cabinet. Normal enough, except for the window that looked out on complete darkness. Not nighttime darkness, the absence kind, like staring into a cave. Your duties are straightforward, Shannon said, pulling a binder from the filing cabinet. Data entry for our specimen catalog. Each item requires precise documentation, location, condition, any changes from previous observations. She flipped through pages filled with entries I couldn't quite read, the handwriting seeming to shift when I tried to focus on it. The work is routine, she continued, though I should mention, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Dickinson understood the importance of perspective. What kind of research do you do here? Agricultural applications primarily, crop enhancement, yield optimization. The words came out rehearsed, like she'd said them too many times to too many people who'd asked the wrong questions. The isolation is necessary for our work. Contamination concerns. She handed me the binder. Begin with the specimen refrigerators. Note their current locations and contents. The units have a tendency to migrate during the night shift. Simply record where you find them. That should have been warning number 2, or maybe 3. I'd lost count. But the pay was double minimum wage, and my landlord had started taping eviction notices to my door. Shannon left me alone in the office. I opened the binder, trying to make sense of the entries. The handwriting wasn't shifting. It was different people, different hands, all documenting the same impossible things. Specimen weights that changed without material being added or removed. Temperature readings that violated thermodynamics. Location coordinates for items that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. I found my first refrigerator at 12:37. It sat in the middle of corridor B7, humming with a sound that made my back teeth vibrate. Industrial-sized, the kind you'd see in a restaurant, except the temperature display showed symbols I'd never seen before. A yellow sticky note on the door read, Unit 3 was in Lab 4 yesterday, RC. Roberto's initials, I guessed. I opened it. The light inside wasn't right. Too blue, too deep, like looking at the ocean from underneath. The shelves held specimen containers, glass jars, sealed bags, metal canisters with warning labels in languages I couldn't identify. And the contents. One jar held crystal fragments that pulsed with their own rhythm, like a heartbeat made of light. The crystals were sharp-edged, geometric in ways that hurt to process, and the pulsing created patterns that almost formed words. Next to it, a sealed container of liquid that flowed upward, pooling against the lid like gravity was just a suggestion it chose to ignore. The liquid was clear but somehow dense, and watching it move made my inner ear complain about directions that shouldn't exist. The bottom shelf made me step back. Tissue samples in petri dishes, pink and gray and colors that didn't have names, all of them moving. Not quickly, just enough to notice if you watched for more than a few seconds. Growing, regenerating. One sample had clearly been cut in half earlier, but now the pieces were reaching toward each other with tiny tendrils. I wrote it all down, my hand surprisingly steady. Location, corridor B7. Contents, crystal specimens, pulsing. Liquid sample, anti-gravity properties. Tissue samples, regenerating. The clinical language felt like armor against what I was seeing. By 3 a.m., I'd found 4 more refrigerators. One in a supply closet, humming behind boxes of printer paper. Another in the women's bathroom, which I discovered when Ellen emerged, looking pale and muttering about Tuesday's location. Each one filled with specimens that belonged in fever dreams, not filing systems. They move on their own, Roberto told me when I found him doing his rounds. He kept his hand on that sharpened rebar like a lifeline. Started about 6 months ago. Shannon says it's the building settling, temperature differentials. But I've seen them. Middle of the night, they just slide, like they're looking for something. Looking for what? He shrugged, but his eyes kept scanning the shadows. Better not to think about it. Just write down where they are. Don't touch anything without gloves. And whatever you do, don't take anything out of the building. They know. They always know. I wanted to ask who they were, but his expression suggested I didn't want that answer. The night wore on. I documented 17 refrigerators in total, each one in a location that made no logical sense. The specimens inside defied every biology course I'd taken, every understanding of how matter should behave. And Shannon's words echoed, routine data entry. At 5:43, I heard the tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. Like Morse code played by something that had just learned about patterns. I followed the sound down Corridor C, past laboratories with numbers that skipped around. Lab 3, Lab 11, Lab 2, Lab 7. The tapping grew louder as I approached Lab 7. A metal door marked with biohazard symbols and a sign, sealed, Chemical Incident 2011, no entry. The tapping came from behind that door, then clear as my own thoughts. Mario. My name, whispered by someone who knew exactly how to pronounce it. Not called out, not shouted, whispered like they were standing right behind me. I backed away, my shoes squeaking on the tile. The tapping stopped, then started again, faster. Tap, 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 tap. And underneath it, more voices. Some I recognized. Roberto's deep rumble, Ellen's nervous pitch. Others I didn't know. All of them saying names, calling out to people who might or might not be there to answer. I ran, not proud of it. But when you hear your name whispered by something behind a door that's been sealed for over a decade, you don't stick around to investigate. Found Shannon in her office reading a thick manual like nothing had happened. She looked up when I knocked. That same detached expression, unchanged. Laboratory 7, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There's something in there. The 2011 incident left residual contamination, she replied without missing a beat. Acoustic phenomena are common. The chemicals interact with the ventilation system, creating auditory illusions. It said my name. Pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli. She turned a page in her manual. Like seeing faces in clouds or hearing voices in white noise. Your brain expects communication, so it creates it. And the others? Roberto, Ellen. I heard their names too. The night shift is small. Your mind fills in familiar patterns. She looked at me over her glasses. This is documented in your employment paperwork, Mr. Porter. Acoustic anomalies are expected. Simply note them in your reports if they interfere with your duties. She went back to reading, the conversation clearly over in her mind. I returned to my office, added a note about Lab 7 to my report. Acoustic phenomena observed, no interference with data collection. The kind of bureaucratic nothing that made horror sound routine. 6 a.m. came like a mercy. Ellen found me in the break room, nursing my 5th cup of coffee. You heard them, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. She checked her watch. 6:02 and 14 seconds. It's worse during electrical storms and full moons. And Tuesdays, though nobody knows why Tuesdays. A bitter laugh. Russell thought he could figure it out. Started tracking patterns, recording the voices. Said they were asking for help. What happened to him? Shannon said family emergency. Ellen's hand shook as she poured her own coffee. But his car's still in the employee lot. Has been for 2 weeks. Security camera footage shows him leaving through the front door, but his key card was used in Lab 7 3 hours after he supposedly left. The morning shift started arriving. Normal people in normal clothes ready for normal jobs in the administrative offices. They didn't go past the first corridor. Probably didn't even know the rest of the building existed. Shannon appeared at exactly 6:30. Productive first night, Mr. Porter. Same time tomorrow? I needed the money. Needed it bad enough to ignore every instinct screaming at me to run. Yeah, I'll be here. Excellent. Remember, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Dickinson understood the necessity of indirect approaches. She walked away, her footsteps echoing in that wrong way, like the building was swallowing the sound and spitting it back out changed. Roberto caught me in the parking lot. In daylight, he looked older, more tired. The bulges under his uniform were definitely armor. Makeshift plates duct taped to his chest and back. You're coming back, he said. Need the job. He nodded slowly. We all did. At first. He glanced back at the building. Word of advice? Start keeping your own records. Not the official ones, real ones. Write down everything. The refrigerators, the voices, the way time moves wrong in the lower levels. Maybe when enough of us document it, someone will listen. The lower levels? His face went pale. You haven't been down there yet. Pray you never have to. The refrigerators are just the beginning. There's a reason this place was built on farmland nobody wanted, soil that wouldn't grow anything but nightmares. He got in his truck, an old Ford held together by rust and determination. 11:45 tonight? Yeah. God help us all. I drove home through morning light that felt fake after the darkness inside Blackwood. My apartment looked different, smaller, safer, more fragile. I sat at my kitchen table and started writing. Not the clinical report Shannon wanted, but the truth. About refrigerators that moved like they were alive. About specimens that violated physics. About voices calling from behind sealed doors. About a place that hired desperate people for the night shift and seemed surprised when they lasted more than a week. I had 6 hours to sleep before my shift at the convenience store. Then back to Blackwood. Back to the specimens and the voices and Shannon's poetry that felt more like warnings than wisdom. Should have run. Should have ignored the money and found another way. But I didn't. And looking back now, knowing what those refrigerators were really looking for, what was actually growing in those tissue samples, what waited behind the door of Laboratory 7, I understand why they needed people like me, desperate enough to stay, observant enough to document, too broke to quit before it was too late. The tapping had been Morse code, I'd realize later. Simple message, repeated endlessly, let us out. 2 weeks in, I learned the hard way about the electromagnetic thing. Was down in corridor C12 documenting another migrating refrigerator. This one had wedged itself behind a water fountain somehow, when my phone started screaming. Not ringing, screaming. The sound that came out of it wasn't any ringtone I'd ever programmed. More like metal tearing mixed with static feedback cranked to 11. The screen went white hot in my pocket, burned right through the fabric before I could yank it out. Thing hit the floor smoking, plastic case warping like melted wax. The screen showed nothing but snow, same kind you'd see on old TVs between channels, except the patterns moved with purpose. Deliberate. Like something was trying to push through from the other side. Then Shannon appeared around the corner, calm as ever. Didn't run. Just walked over in those measured steps of hers, bent down, and picked up my phone with her bare hand. The thing had to be 200 degrees easy, but she didn't flinch. Just held it up, examined it like a specimen. "Ah," she said. "You brought electronics past sub-level marker 3. She pointed to a small yellow triangle on the wall I hadn't noticed. Just a number 3 inside, nothing else. No warnings about phones exploding or anything useful like that. Electronic devices create complications below certain levels, Shannon explained, still holding my melting phone. The interference patterns interact poorly with our research subjects. Think of it as an allergic reaction, but electromagnetic. She demonstrated then, right there in the corridor, pulled off her wristwatch first, one of those old analog types with actual gears. Set it on the floor, then her facility phone from her lab coat pocket, even pulled a small flashlight from another pocket, the LED kind. Before descending to any basement level, she said, arranging the items in a neat line, all electronic devices must be removed. This includes phones, watches, tablets, anything with a battery or circuit board, even some mechanical watches if they contain certain metals. I remember asking what happened if you forgot. Seemed like a reasonable question at the time. Shannon tilted her head, considering. Various reactions depending on the level and the specific research materials present. Level 1 might cause mild interference, static, dead batteries. Level 2 begins thermal events as you've experienced. Level 3, she paused. Level 3 and below, the reactions become more animated. Some of our specimens respond violently to electromagnetic fields. They perceive them as threats. Animated. That was the word she used. Not dangerous or deadly. Animated. Like we were talking about cartoon characters instead of whatever lurked in those basement labs. She quoted Sylvia Plath then. "I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. Each level represents a different branch, Mr. Porter. Some branches we don't climb if we wish to continue growing. The whole thing should have sent me running. But the way Shannon delivered it all matter of fact, like she was explaining microwave safety instead of entities that attacked cell phones, somehow that made it worse. Made it real in a way that panic couldn't touch. Started noticing the security monitors after that conversation. Hundreds of them throughout the facility, those little black domes in every corner. But here's what struck me. They all faced inward. Every single camera pointed toward the center of rooms, toward doorways and corridors. Not a single one aimed at the basement access points. Not one watching those yellow warning triangles or the heavy doors that led down to the lower levels. Roberto confirmed it when I asked during a coffee break. "Cameras are for watching us," he said, tapping his temple. "Making sure we follow protocols, don't take anything home. But down below, they learned pretty quick that cameras don't last. Same as phones. Whatever's down there doesn't like being watched." The real education came during my third week when Shannon assigned me to file some overflow documents, normal office work, or so I thought. She handed me a cardboard banker's box, told me to sort the contents by department and apply the appropriate routing labels. I set up in the empty conference room on the second floor. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, coffee getting cold on the table. Opened that box expecting invoices, maybe purchase orders, standard paperwork. First folder contained photographs of human tissue samples, not medical textbook clean either. These were raw, wet-looking even in the pictures. Labels underneath each photo had patient numbers instead of names. BP 47, BP 93. Some of the tissue samples showed cellular structures that didn't match anything I'd seen in high school biology. Too many nuclei, cell walls that branched like fractals. Next folder held brain scans. MRIs, I think, though I'm no doctor. The images showed neural activity, these bright webs of light inside skull outlines. But the patterns were wrong. Human brains fire in certain ways, follow specific pathways. These scans showed activity in places that should have been dead tissue, lit up like Christmas trees in regions that controlled involuntary functions. Heartbeat, breathing, cellular regeneration. One scan showed activity outside the skull entirely, like thoughts bleeding into the air around the patient's head. Found myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The conference room had glass walls, and I kept expecting Shannon to appear, tell me I'd grabbed the wrong box, but nobody came. Just me and those impossible medical files. The sealed containers were worse. 3 of them at the bottom of the box, each about the size of a mason jar. Clear plastic with biohazard symbols, specimen numbers etched into the lids. The contents moved, not sloshing like liquid, deliberate movement. One contained what looked like nerve tissue, gray-white strands that twisted and coiled on their own. Another held something dark, almost black, that pressed against the container walls in rhythmic pulses. The third I couldn't identify at all. Just knew it was organic and very much alive despite being sealed in an airtight container with no food, water, or oxygen supply. Shannon found me staring at them 20 minutes later. Didn't knock, just walked in like she'd been timing it. "Ah, you've reached the specialty items," she said. "Those require blue labels and express routing to Laboratory 4. She pulled a sheet of blue labels from her lab coat, because of course she'd brought them, knowing exactly what that box contained. Showed me how to apply them to the container lids without touching the specimens directly. "These samples represent breakthrough research," she explained while I worked. "Cellular structures that defy traditional biological constraints, tissue that regenerates without stem cells, neural matter that maintains coherent activity patterns post-extraction." Post-extraction, meaning after removal from the body, meaning those nerve strands twisting in the jar had been cut out of something, someone, and kept moving anyway. I started to ask where the samples came from, but Shannon cut me off with another poetry quote. Dickinson again. "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. The classification system exists for a reason, Mr. Porter. Blue labels indicate materials requiring specialized handling. The routing ensures they reach researchers equipped to pursue their full potential." The files themselves felt wrong under my fingers. Some pages warmer than they should be, like they'd just come from a printer. Others hummed with subtle vibration, so faint I might have imagined it. One folder's contents shifted weight as I carried it, heavy on one side, then the other, like something inside was moving. Shannon watched me sort everything with those dark eyes of hers, occasionally correcting my label placement or redirecting a file to a different department. She knew exactly where each document needed to go without checking any reference sheets. Knew which lab would receive the tissue samples, which department studied the impossible brain scans. "The facility operates on a need-to-know basis," she said, as I sealed up the sorted files. "But those who work here long enough develop an intuitive understanding of our research goals. You'll find the patterns reveal themselves over time." Patterns, research goals, clinical terms for whatever nightmare they were building in those basement laboratories. Because by then I'd started to understand, really understand, what kind of place hired desperate people for night shifts. What kind of research needed security guards with homemade armor and employees who vanished after asking questions. The Blackwood Research Facility wasn't studying agricultural genetics or soil remediation or any of the cover stories they sold to the state. They were studying things that shouldn't exist, creating them maybe, taking human tissue and twisting it into new shapes, recording brain activity that violated every principle of neuroscience. And I was helping them do it. filing their research, tracking their specimens, maintaining their records while the evidence of their real work sat in sealed containers, twitching with impossible life. 3 days into the job, Ellen caught me heading toward the employee lounge with my thermos. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. Not there. Her eyes darted to her watch, always checking that watch. "You want to take breaks? There's only 3 places. The main lobby, Station B by the loading dock, supply closet corridor on the 2nd floor." I pulled free, coffee sloshing in my thermos. "What's wrong with the lounge?" "Everything." She looked down the hall like something might be listening. "Those 3 spots, they're..." She struggled for the word. "Neutral. Everywhere else, especially after 1 a.m. Her voice dropped to nothing. That's when I understood breaks weren't about resting. They were survival protocols. The lobby made sense. Wide open space, multiple exits, those heavy glass doors between you and whatever roamed the halls. Station B had its own logic. Loading dock meant trucks, deliveries, connection to the outside world. The dock door stayed cracked open just enough to let in real air, not the recycled stuff that tasted like copper pennies after midnight. The supply closet corridor puzzled me until I spent a break there. 2nd floor, northwest corner, lined with metal shelving units full of printer paper and toner cartridges. Boring. Safe. Nothing there worth studying or cataloging. Nothing that might wake up hungry. Russell Gonzalez didn't believe in safe zones. Kid showed up my 2nd Monday. Couldn't have been more than 22. Fresh out of college with that swagger young guys get when they think they know everything. Wore his business casual like a costume, shirt too crisp, shoes too shiny. Shannon gave him the same tour she'd given me, same warnings delivered in that flat voice of hers. He nodded through it all with this little smirk. "Bunch of ghost stories," he told me during his 2nd night. We were documenting refrigerators in corridor D9, him scribbling notes while I checked serial numbers. Psychological manipulation to increase productivity through manufactured fear. I didn't argue. What was the point? Some people need to touch the stove to believe it's hot. His first week, Thursday night, that's when it happened. 2:15 a.m., break time. Ellen tried to steer him toward the lobby, practically begging. "Russell, please, just 15 minutes in the lobby. We can get coffee from the machine." He laughed, actually laughed at her. "I'm taking my break where I want. This isn't prison." He headed straight for the employee lounge. Worse, he turned left at the junction, toward the Laboratory 7 corridor. Ellen followed for maybe 10 steps before stopping like she'd hit an invisible wall. "Mario." Her voice cracked. "He's going to 7. We watched him disappear around the corner, whistling some pop song. Ellen's hands shook so bad she dropped her clipboard. Papers scattered across the floor. Specimen logs, refrigerator migration charts, things that couldn't leave the building. "Should we..." I started gathering papers. "No." She pressed her back against the wall. "We don't follow. Not there. Not ever." 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. Russell never came back from break. I found his access badge the next morning, lying in the middle of corridor B4 like someone had placed it there deliberately. The plastic was warped, photo melted beyond recognition, but the name strip remained clear. R. Gonzalez, Night Research Assistant. The badge reader wouldn't recognize it. When I tried to look up his employee number in the system, nothing came up. No hiring records, no orientation paperwork. No Russell Gonzalez had ever worked at Blackwood Research Facility, according to the database. Shannon took the badge from me without comment, dropped it in a manila envelope already half full of similar warped plastic rectangles. "Turnover happens," she said, filing the envelope in a drawer marked voluntary separations. "Some people aren't suited for night work." I checked the security footage myself during my next break. Every camera that should have caught Russell's path showed the same thing. Static. Not normal interference, but patterns in the snow. Shapes that almost looked like reaching hands or opening mouths if you stared too long. The mechanical sounds started after that. 2 weeks later, middle of my break at Station B, I heard them rising from the basement vents, grinding gears, metal scraping concrete, rhythmic clanking like some massive machine warming up. Then came the screaming, not human exactly, electronic, like dial-up modems dying, hard drives failing, every piece of technology crying out in binary agony. Ellen found me pressed against the loading dock door, trying to breathe outside air. "You hear it too?" Not a question. She crouched beside me, keeping one hand on the door handle, ready to run. Started right after Russell. Every night now, getting louder. She led me to a ventilation grate near the dock, knelt down, pointed. I had to lean close to see through the metal slats. Down in the basement level, lights flickered, not electric lights. These pulsed with purpose, blue-white flashes in deliberate sequences. Short, 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 long, 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 short, short, short. SOS. That's not possible, I whispered. Lights don't. Nothing here is possible. Ellen's fingers tightened on my shoulder. But it happens anyway. The pattern repeated, over and over. Sometimes other sequences interrupted, longer flashes, complex rhythms I couldn't decode. Almost like conversation, like something down there was trying to talk to something else, comparing notes, planning. Ellen stood abruptly, pulled me up with her. Break's over, don't mention this to Shannon. I didn't need to. Shannon already knew. She always knew. My third week, things escalated. Thursday night, 11:45 p.m. I was finishing my last refrigerator documentation in Laboratory 2, trying to ignore the way the tissue samples inside seemed to track my movements. The wall clock showed 5 minutes to midnight, plenty of time to reach the exit, clock out, get to my car. Ellen burst through the door like something was chasing her. Out, now! She grabbed my clipboard, threw it on the counter. Leave it, move! I need to finish, now! She hauled me toward the door with surprising strength. Her ponytail had come loose, dark hair hanging in her face. The burn scar on her hand looked fresh in the fluorescent light, red and angry. Ellen, what? Midnight deadline is absolute. You never stay past midnight. Never. She dragged me down the corridor, past confused night staff heading to their stations. Shannon should have told you. She should have. God, hurry up. My watch showed 11:58 as we hit the main lobby. Shannon stood by the exit doors, holding something I'd never seen before. A gray metal box covered in warning labels, cables running to what looked like capacitor banks. An electromagnetic pulse device, military grade. Cutting it close, Ms. Chandler. Shannon's voice remained perfectly calm while her fingers flew over the device's controls. Though I suppose dramatic exits run in your family. Ellen shoved me through the doors. Get to your car. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Behind us, through the glass, I saw Shannon flip a switch. Every light in the facility flickered, not power failure, but something else. The lights pulsed in rhythm, like the building's electrical system was breathing. Midnight transformation protocol initiated, Shannon called out, her words carrying despite the glass between us. All electromagnetic barriers active, containment fields at maximum. The parking lot lights dimmed. My car's dashboard clock clicked over to 12 a.m., and every radio station turned to static. In my rearview mirror, I watched the facility change. Not physically, the building stayed the same, but shadows moved wrong behind the windows. Things that should have been still weren't. Things that should have been empty, filled with writhing darkness. Ellen stood in the parking lot until my taillights disappeared, making sure I left. Making sure I didn't turn back to see what Blackwood Research Facility became after midnight, when the pretense of normal operations dropped away and the real work began. I made it home in record time, breaking every speed limit between the facility and my apartment. My hands didn't stop shaking until dawn. The next night, I showed up at 11:45 as usual. Shannon met me at the door with her typical greeting, some quote about time being a flat circle. She didn't mention the midnight evacuation. Ellen avoided my eyes during our shift briefing. But I'd learned the final rule, the one they saved for employees who survived long enough to need it. Blackwood Research Facility operated on a careful schedule. We could document the impossible, catalog the things that shouldn't exist, file reports on specimens that defied physics, but only until midnight. After midnight, the facility belonged to something else. 3 weeks in, I watched Ellen completely fall apart. She'd always been anxious about time, but now she couldn't go 30 seconds without checking that watch. Middle of documenting a refrigerator in corridor A6, she'd stop writing, twist her wrist up, stare at the dial, count under her breath, check it again. The burn scar on her right hand looked angrier each night, like the old wound remembered something her mind tried to forget. 10:47, she'd whisper. 13 minutes to 11, then 1 hour to midnight. I tried talking to her during our 2 a.m. break at Station B, asked if she was okay. She just shook her head, ponytail swinging, and showed me her clipboard. Every single entry had timestamps down to the second. Not just what time she found each refrigerator, but when she opened it, when she closed it, When she moved to the next corridor, the margins filled with calculations. How many minutes to document each specimen? How long to walk between locations, exactly when she needed to start heading for the exits. "You have to know where you are," she said, tapping the watch face. "Every second, because if you lose track, if you stay too long." She didn't finish, just went back to her calculations. Roberto was worse. The paranoia I'd noticed my first night had turned into something raw and animal. Found him in corridor C9, sharpening a piece of rebar against the concrete wall, metal screeching with each stroke. He'd added more armor under his uniform. Could see the bulges where he duct-taped what looked like metal filing cabinet drawers to his chest and back. Jangled when he walked. "They're getting bolder," he told me, not looking up from his sharpening. Used to stay in 7, in the deep levels. But now, he tested the rebar's point against his thumb, drew blood, nodded with satisfaction. "Now they follow. You hear them yet? In the walls?" I had. Scratching sounds that tracked our movements through the corridors. Sometimes a voice that sounded almost like Russell, asking for help from inside the ventilation system. Roberto had started carrying 3 weapons minimum. The sharpened rebar, a box cutter with the blade extended, and something that looked like a shiv made from a broken clipboard. Saw him talking to himself during rounds, arguing with someone who wasn't there. "I'm not going down there," he'd mutter. "Don't care what you promise. I know what you are." The pieces started coming together my 4th week, not all at once, more like a picture slowly developing in those old dark rooms. Started when I found a manila folder Shannon had left on my desk. Standard routing, needed to go to Laboratory 4, but inside were discharge papers, medical discharge papers, for someone named Bradley Patterson, dated 6 months ago. The diagnoses made my hands shake. Severe cognitive dysfunction following experimental treatment. Patient exhibits multiple concurrent thought patterns. Recommend permanent institutional care. More folders appeared over the next few nights, always left casually, like Shannon forgot them. Treatment consent forms where desperate people signed away rights I didn't know you could sign away. Waiving claims for consciousness disruption and permanent neurological restructuring. The signatures all looked the same, shaky hands of people who needed money bad enough to risk everything. Then I found the recruitment ads, not current ones. These were photocopies from 6 months back. Maybe a year. Same promises that brought me here. Good pay, no experience needed, must be available for night shift. But the older ones had different contact numbers. I recognized one from the discharge papers. Bradley Patterson had been employee number 47, BP 47. The tissue samples in those jars. Jesus Christ. They weren't studying agricultural genetics. They were studying us. The consciousness transfer research came together from fragments, progress reports about successful neural pattern extraction and 40% consciousness retention in secondary substrate, photos of brain tissue that looked wrong because it held 2 minds, the original and something else forced inside. The specimens in those refrigerators weren't random biological anomalies. They were people, what was left of them. Shannon knew I was figuring it out, started quoting different poets, darker ones. "The art of losing isn't hard to master," she said one night, watching me sort through another box of horror. "Though it may look like disaster. The company recruited people like me on purpose. People drowning in debt, people with sick relatives, people who'd show up even after seeing impossible things because the alternative was worse. We weren't employees, we were inventory, test subjects who came pre-screened for desperation. Roberto had been here 8 months. Ellen, almost a year. They'd watched dozens of us cycle through. Some quit early, like the smart ones. Some disappeared, like Russell, who asked too many questions. And some ended up in refrigerators, their consciousness trapped in tissue samples or successfully transferred to something else. Something that helped keep the secret by eliminating problems. The entities weren't accidents or failures. They were security. What better way to maintain silence than to let the successful experiments handle the cleanup? Russell hadn't just disappeared, he'd been processed, and whatever they'd put his mind into now lived in Laboratory 7, tapping out Morse code warnings nobody would heed. I made my decision Thursday of week 4. Didn't tell anyone. Couldn't risk Shannon knowing or Ellen trying to talk me out of it from some misguided protective instinct. Just started writing everything down during my breaks. Every protocol, every warning, every pattern I'd noticed. Used a composition notebook from the supply closet, the kind with the black and white marbled cover. Wrote about the yellow triangles and electromagnetic interference. the midnight evacuation and transformation protocol, which corridors stayed safe and which turned hungry after 1 a.m., how to recognize when a refrigerator's contents were looking back at you, the sounds that meant run versus the sounds that meant freeze, everything Roberto and Ellen had taught me, everything I'd learned the hard way. The last night, I stayed late finishing it, made sure every warning was clear, every survival tactic explained, even drew a map of the safe zones, marked the emergency exits that actually opened, dated each entry so whoever found it would know this was recent intelligence, that the patterns hadn't changed yet. Tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk, under the overflow specimen logs. Someone would find it. Some other broke bastard who took this job because they didn't have choices. Maybe they'd be smarter than me. Maybe they'd read it and run before the place got its hooks in. Maybe they'd last longer than Russell.